The rhythmic tapping of Caleb Lancaster's pen against the polished mahogany desk was the only sound in the vast, glass-walled office. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretched endlessly, bathed in the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. The empire he had built stood as a testament to his dedication, his sacrifices, his relentless pursuit of success. Yet despite the power and prestige, a strange hollowness clung to the edges of his mind, a whisper in the silence, an absence that no amount of wealth could fill. "Mr. Lancaster, your 5 o'clock with the investors is ready," his assistant James announced from the doorway. Caleb exhaled sharply, nodding as he straightened his tie. "Send them in." The meeting proceeded like clockwork: projections, growth strategies, expansion plans. Caleb spoke with the confidence of a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft. The investors listened, enraptured, assured that their money was in the hands of a man who never lost. When it ended, hands were shaken, deals were sealed, and Caleb retreated to his private lounge, where a crystal decanter of whiskey awaited him. He poured himself a glass and stared out the window, the weight of his own thoughts pressing heavily against his chest. A knock at the door interrupted his solitude. James entered, hesitating slightly. "Sir, the gala for the foundation is tonight. You're still planning to attend?" Caleb nodded absently. "Yes, of course." James hesitated. "It's the anniversary, isn't it?" Caleb's grip tightened around the glass. He didn't respond. James cleared his throat. "Would you like me to arrange something?" "That won't be necessary," Caleb cut him off, his voice sharp. "That'll be all, James." His assistant nodded and left without another word. Alone again, Caleb exhaled, rubbing his temple. The anniversary. 5 years. The memory surfaced like a phantom he could never quite banish, the slamming of a door, an argument echoing through the vast halls of his mansion, and Hazel's voice, raw with emotion. "You don't even see me, do you?" He had seen her, or at least he thought he had. She was his daughter, his only child. He had provided for her, given her everything, and yet it hadn't been enough. She had left that night, disappearing into the city, leaving behind nothing but an empty room and a silence that had never been broken. For months he had searched. He had hired private investigators, followed every lead, and then nothing. At some point he had convinced himself that she was fine, that she had chosen her own path, and that he had done all he could. Work had swallowed him again, and life had moved forward. At least, that's what he told himself. The gala was a grand affair, a sea of tailored suits and glittering dresses. Champagne flowed, deals were brokered with laughter and handshakes, and Caleb played his part flawlessly. Yet beneath the polished facade, a gnawing sense of detachment remained. He stood near the bar, sipping his drink when a familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. Caleb Lancaster, the man himself. He turned to see Richard Moore, a journalist from one of the city's most reputable financial publications. A sharp man with a sharper pen. Caleb offered a tight smile. "Richard, enjoying the event?" "Oh, always," Richard said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Tell me, Caleb, after all these years, do you ever feel like you've reached the top?" Caleb chuckled, a practiced, effortless sound. "The top is just another step before the next climb." Richard smirked, always the businessman. He paused, then added, "And what about your family, Caleb? Any new developments there?" The words hit like an unexpected blow. Caleb's jaw tensed, though he masked it quickly. "Business and family are separate matters," he said coolly. Richard studied him for a beat, then shrugged. "Fair enough." He took a sip of his drink. "But you know, people love a story of redemption. A father looking for his lost daughter. That would be quite the headline." Caleb forced a polite smile. "I'm sure it would." But as Richard walked away, the journalist's words lingered, settling uncomfortably in his mind. Was it redemption he needed? Or was it something else entirely? The night stretched on, but Caleb's presence at the gala felt increasingly hollow. Eventually he excused himself, stepping outside for a breath of air. The city pulsed around him, neon lights flickering, car horns blaring, life moving forward in relentless motion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in years, but tonight the habit resurfaced like an old ghost. He lit it, inhaling deeply, feeling the burn in his lungs. The past had a way of creeping up when least expected. As the smoke curled into the night, his mind wandered back to Hazel. Where was she now? Was she safe? Was she... A sudden wave of unease washed over him. For the first time in years, the thought of her absence didn't just feel like an old regret. It felt like an open wound, one he had been too proud to acknowledge, and for the first time he wondered if she had ever truly been lost, or if he had simply stopped looking. The city glittered through the tinted windows of Caleb's car as he sat in the back seat, staring at the skyline without really seeing it. His fingers tapped idly against his knee, his mind replaying Richard Moore's words from the gala. A father looking for his lost daughter. That would be quite the headline. The sentence had been thrown out casually, just another conversation over expensive whiskey. But it had stuck. It had lingered. He exhaled sharply, shifting his gaze to his own reflection in the glass. The face staring back at him was composed, unreadable. Years of corporate battles had trained him well, and yet beneath the controlled exterior, something stirred. "Sir?" James's voice broke through his thoughts from the driver's seat. "Are we heading home?" Caleb hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, the words slipped out. "No, take me to the office." James glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but didn't question it. The car turned, weaving through the night streets, until it pulled up in front of the Lancaster Industries Tower. Inside, the building was almost deserted, the usual hum of employees replaced by an eerie silence. Caleb walked through the corridors, his footsteps echoing. His office was just as he had left it, immaculate, controlled, a world of order. But tonight, order wasn't what he needed. He crossed the room and unlocked a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath a stack of neatly filed documents, was an old brown envelope. He pulled it out carefully, his fingers brushing over the creased edges before opening it. Photos spilled onto his desk. Hazel, at 15, standing on the balcony of their estate, arms crossed, gaze defiant. 16, at one of his business dinners, looking bored and out of place. 17, the last picture he had of her before she left, hair wild, eyes stormy, anger simmering just beneath the surface. And then, nothing. No photos after that. No trace of the years that followed, just silence. His jaw tightened. He had searched for her, hired private investigators, followed leads, but eventually the trail had gone cold, and when it did, he let it stay that way. Had he given up? Caleb closed his eyes, leaning back against his chair. He didn't want to answer that. Instead, he let himself slip into memory. The fight had started over something small. It always did. "You don't even care, do you?" Hazel's voice had trembled with anger, but her eyes were sharp, burning. "I'm providing for you," Caleb had said, his tone clipped, exhausted. "You have everything. I don't want everything. I want you." The words had stopped him in his tracks. Hazel had shaken her head, stepping back. "No, never mind. I don't even know why I bother." Caleb had exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Hazel, you're being dramatic." That had been the final straw. Her eyes had darkened, her hands balled into fists. "You don't see me, Dad. You never have." And then she had walked out. At the time, Caleb had convinced himself she would come back, that it was just another one of her rebellions. But days passed, then weeks, then months, and she never returned. Caleb opened his eyes, the weight of memory settling deep into his chest. He stared at the photos again. Then, moving with newfound determination, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "This is Carter. I need you to find someone for me," Caleb said. A pause. Then, "Hazel?" Caleb's grip tightened on the phone. "Yes." Another pause. Then Carter sighed. "It's been 5 years, Lancaster. If she wanted to be found, just find her." A beat of silence, then, "I'll see what I can do." Caleb hung up, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the past through a rearview mirror. He was turning the car around. The streets were alive with movement, people rushing home, neon signs flickering in the evening haze, the distant hum of traffic blending into the city's rhythm. Caleb Lancaster walked with purpose, his mind preoccupied, his steps brisk against the pavement. His lunch meeting had ended earlier than expected. Another successful negotiation, another deal sealed, another number added to his ever-growing empire. But today it felt different. Since last night his mind had been restless. Sleep had been fleeting, haunted by the resurfaced memories of Hazel. He had woken up feeling something unfamiliar, an itch of unease, a weight he couldn't quite shake. His thoughts churned as he walked past the bustling storefronts and sidewalk cafes. Then, without warning, he felt it. A strange pull, someone was watching him. Caleb's steps faltered. He turned his head slightly, scanning the sidewalk ahead. And then he saw her. Sitting on the curb, tucked between a streetlight and the wall of a corner store, was a figure so frail, so ghostly, that for a moment he thought he was imagining it. She was thin, too thin. Her hair, once vibrant and wild, now clung to her face in tangled strands. Her clothes, oversized, torn at the edges, looked like they had been worn for far too many days without rest. But it was the eyes that stopped him. Hazel. His breath caught in his throat. She was staring right at him, not with shock, not with hope, but with something deeper, something raw. Recognition. A storm of emotions crashed into him all at once. Disbelief, guilt, fear. His chest tightened. His feet felt cemented to the ground. Hazel's gaze didn't waver. Then slowly she pushed herself up from the curb. Caleb wanted to speak, but no words came. Hazel took a hesitant step forward, her expression unreadable. And then, in a voice so quiet it was barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Dad?" The world around him blurred. The noise of the city dulled into the background. She was here. She was alive. But she was also broken. His throat felt dry. He wanted to close the distance between them, to reach for her, to... Hazel took another step, her face shadowed by the flickering light of the street lamp. "You never looked for me." The words were soft, but they sliced through him with the force of a blade. Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. He had looked for her. He had hired people. He had followed leads. But then, at some point, he had let her go. Hazel's expression didn't change. If she was waiting for him to say something, to offer some excuse, some justification, he had none. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned away. She walked past him, shoulders hunched, disappearing into the crowd. Caleb's body moved before his mind could catch up. "Hazel!" His voice cracked slightly, but she didn't stop. For the first time in his life, Caleb Lancaster chased after someone. Caleb pushed through the crowded sidewalk, his pulse pounding in his ears. Hazel walked ahead of him, her steps quick, her posture tense. "Hazel, wait!" he called out. She didn't turn around. He quickened his pace, maneuvering through the evening crowd until he was close enough to reach for her arm. He hesitated, his fingers hovering just above the tattered fabric of her sleeve. "I said wait," he tried again, softer this time. Hazel stopped. For a brief moment, Caleb thought she might actually face him. But instead she tilted her head slightly, just enough for him to see her profile. "You don't get to do this." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharp as broken glass. Caleb swallowed hard. "Do what?" Hazel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Act like you care. Like you've been searching for me all this time." The accusation stung more than he expected. "I did look for you," he said carefully. "For months. I hired investigators," Hazel cut in, finally turning to face him. "How long did you wait before you stopped? A year, 6 months?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." Hazel studied him for a long moment. "It never is with you." She turned again, walking toward the intersection. The traffic light flickered from yellow to red and she paused at the curb. Caleb took a deep breath. "Hazel, let me help you." She flinched, just barely, but he saw it. Then she turned her head slightly, giving him a sideways glance. "Help me?" Her lips curled, but there was no amusement in her expression. "With what? Money? A place to stay?" "Yes." The word came out too fast, too desperate. Hazel exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I don't need your guilt, Dad. I don't need your money either." The light turned green, and before he could say another word, she stepped into the street. Caleb watched as she disappeared into the night. Caleb pushed through the crowded sidewalk, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Hazel moved quickly, weaving between pedestrians, her thin frame almost disappearing into the flow of people. "Hazel!" he called again, his voice rough, desperate. She didn't stop. She didn't even turn her head. Caleb picked up his pace, dodging a man carrying grocery bags, nearly colliding with a cyclist as he stepped onto the street. His mind raced. What would he say when he caught up to her? How could he even begin to explain the years of silence, the unanswered questions, the choices he had made? But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was that he had found her, and he couldn't lose her again. Finally, Hazel slowed near a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Caleb seized the moment. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the sleeve of her worn-out jacket. She tensed instantly, her entire body rigid, but she didn't turn to face him. "Hazel, please," Caleb breathed, barely recognizing his own voice. Slowly, she turned. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes that once held so much fire, were guarded, distant. "I have nothing to say to you," she murmured. Caleb swallowed the lump in his throat. "Then let me talk." The light changed. People began moving, and Hazel took a step back, out of his reach. "You think you can just show up and fix everything?" she asked, her tone flat, emotionless. Caleb exhaled sharply. You didn't look for me." Her voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it, a raw edge that made his chest tighten. "That's not true," he said quickly. "I did. I tried." Hazel let out a hollow laugh. "And when did you stop trying?" Caleb flinched. He had no answer for that. Hazel studied him for a moment, and whatever she saw in his face made her shake her head. "Just go back to your perfect life, Dad." The word sounded bitter on her tongue. "I don't need you." Caleb took a step forward, but she held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Caleb stood frozen as she disappeared into the night. Caleb stood motionless on the sidewalk, his pulse hammering in his ears as Hazel vanished into the crowd. His body screamed for him to follow, but his feet wouldn't move. She was gone. Again. The weight of it settled deep in his chest, heavier than it had ever been before. But this time there was no illusion of choice. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. With renewed determination, he forced himself to move. He didn't know where she was heading, but instinct drove him forward. Minutes passed, the city blurring around him. Then, just as he was about to lose hope, he spotted her. She was standing outside a run-down diner, peering through the glass window. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from something more than just the cold. Caleb hesitated for only a second before approaching. "I know you don't want me here," he said quietly. Hazel stiffened, but didn't turn around. "I just want to buy you dinner," he continued, his voice careful, measured. "That's all." A beat of silence. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," Caleb said, stepping beside her. "It's dinner." Hazel exhaled sharply, the smallest hint of frustration in her breath. But after a long pause, she muttered, "Fine." They walked inside together, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb sat across from his daughter. The diner was small, the kind of place Caleb wouldn't have noticed before tonight. Faded vinyl booths, the scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. A waitress came by, her gaze flickering between them before offering a polite smile. Hazel barely looked at the menu. "Burger. No onions. Water." Caleb ordered without thinking, his focus entirely on her. Up close, the harsh reality of what she had been through was impossible to ignore. The dark circles under her eyes, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she toyed with the salt shaker. "I never stopped looking for you," Caleb said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Hazel let out a quiet scoff, but she didn't look at him. "Sure. It's the truth." She finally met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something beyond the anger. He saw hurt. "Then where were you?" Her voice wavered, just slightly. "Where were you when I had nowhere to go? When I was sleeping in bus stations? When I—" She cut herself off, shaking her head. "You gave up, Dad. Admit it." Caleb clenched his jaw. Just say it." The words lodged in his throat. Hazel's eyes burned into him, waiting, daring him to tell the truth. And for the first time in years, Caleb Lancaster, the man who always had the right answer, had nothing to say. The silence between them stretched unbearably, thick with everything left unsaid. The waitress arrived, placing their plates down without a word, sensing the tension. Hazel picked up her burger but only stared at it, her fingers absently peeling at the edges of the bun. Caleb forced himself to speak. "I should have tried harder." Hazel let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's the understatement of the year." Caleb exhaled slowly. "I thought—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I thought you didn't want to be found." Hazel's grip on the burger tightened. "That's convenient." Caleb didn't flinch. "I don't expect you to believe me. I don't expect you to forgive me." He paused. "But I want to help you now." Hazel's gaze flickered to him, sharp and suspicious. "Help me how? Buy me dinner? Hand me a few bills so you can feel better about yourself?" He shook his head. "No." "Then what, Dad?" Hazel's voice rose slightly, eyes flashing with frustration. "Are you going to take me back to your mansion, introduce me to your perfect friends, pretend like nothing happened?" Caleb set his fork down carefully. "I don't want to pretend, Hazel. I just want to know you're okay." Hazel studied him, as if searching for a lie. Finally, she exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't need your money." "I didn't say you did." She hesitated, her walls still up, but there was something different in her expression now, a crack in the armor. "Just let me get you a place to stay tonight," Caleb offered, his voice softer. "A warm bed, no expectations, no strings." Hazel bit her lip, considering. Then, finally, she muttered, "One night." Caleb nodded. One night. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Caleb gripped the edge of the table, his pulse hammering as Hazel's words settled deep into his bones. Just say it. Admit that he had stopped looking. Admit that at some point he had let go. But how could he? How could he put into words something so unforgivable? Hazel exhaled sharply and shook her head. "That's what I thought." The waitress arrived with their food, setting down the plates with a hesitant glance between them. Hazel didn't acknowledge her. She picked up a fry and took a slow bite, her expression unreadable. Caleb forced himself to do the same, even though the lump in his throat made swallowing nearly impossible. "I made mistakes," he finally said. His voice was low, strained. "I thought—" He hesitated. "I convinced myself you were okay, that you had chosen this, that you didn't want to be found." Hazel scoffed. "You convinced yourself? That's a nice way of saying you gave up." Caleb clenched his jaw. "I never gave up on you, Hazel." She set down her burger, meeting his gaze with quiet intensity. "Then where the hell were you?" He swallowed hard. "I don't have an excuse." Hazel blinked, as if surprised by his honesty. But she recovered quickly, leaning back in the booth. "Doesn't change anything." "No," Caleb admitted. "But it's the truth." She looked away, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the tabletop. "I don't know what you want from me." Caleb studied her carefully. "I don't want anything, I just—" He exhaled, struggling to find the right words. "I just want to know how you are." Hazel let out a hollow laugh. "You see how I am. I want to hear it from you." Hazel's expression flickered, something raw, something real, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She pushed her plate away. "I should go." Panic flared in Caleb's chest. "Hazel, wait!" But she was already standing, pulling her jacket tighter around her thin frame. Caleb reached for his wallet and tossed some bills on the table. Then, before she could slip away again, he stood and blocked her path. "I won't stop you," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "But let me at least get you a hotel for the night." Hazel stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't need your money." "It's not about money," Caleb said. "It's about having a warm bed for one night." A flicker of hesitation, a war behind her eyes. Then, finally, she exhaled. "Just for one night." Caleb nodded, relief flooding through him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The hotel lobby was warm, the soft glow of chandeliers casting a golden hue over the polished marble floors. It was a stark contrast to the cold streets outside, to the harsh reality Hazel had been living. She stood beside Caleb, her arms wrapped around herself, her body tense. She didn't belong in a place like this, at least That's how she made it seem. But Caleb remembered. Once she had belonged anywhere. She had walked through the grandest halls with her head high, unafraid. Now she shifted her weight uncomfortably as the receptionist handed over the key card. "Rooms on the 7th floor," the woman said, with a polite smile. Hazel took the card without a word. She turned to Caleb, her expression guarded. "Thanks," she muttered. "For the room." Caleb nodded. "If you need anything—" "I won't," she cut in quickly. Then, without another word, she walked toward the elevators. Caleb watched her go, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. Every instinct told him to follow, to do more, to fix this. But he knew that if he pushed too hard, she'd run again. So he let her go. For now. Hazel swiped the keycard and stepped inside the hotel room. It was simple, clean, warm, and it felt wrong. She set her bag down by the door. The bed was massive, covered in crisp white sheets. The bathroom was stocked with fresh towels, miniature soaps, a hot shower waiting for her. Everything she hadn't had in years. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt like a stranger in her own skin. She hesitated before stepping into the bathroom. She turned on the faucet and watched as steaming water poured into the sink. Slowly she reached out, cupping the warmth in her hands. A lump formed in her throat. She didn't cry. She never did anymore. But something inside her cracked just a little. Caleb had just stepped outside the hotel when a voice stopped him. "Well, well, if it isn't the great Caleb Lancaster." Caleb turned sharply, his body tensing. A man leaned against the street lamp, smirking. He was rough around the edges, dark hair, a scar running down his cheek, an air of confidence that only came from surviving things most wouldn't. Caleb's instincts screamed trouble. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. The man stepped forward lazily. "Name's Jace." He tilted his head. "Hazel and I go way back." Caleb's pulse spiked. "What do you want?" Jace chuckled. "Relax, big guy. I'm just saying hi." His smirk widened. "But since we're on the topic, you do realize she doesn't belong in your world anymore, right?" Caleb's fists clenched. "Stay away from her." Jace laughed. "You think you can just swoop in and fix things?" He leaned in slightly. "Hey, you don't know the first thing about what she's been through." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then maybe you should enlighten me." Jace's smirk faltered for a split second before he took a step back. "Doesn't work that way." He shoved his hands into his pockets. "But I'll say this. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night. Caleb exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Hazel was in deeper than he had realized. And he wasn't going anywhere until he pulled her out. Hazel woke to a dull ache in her body, the unfamiliar sensation of warmth wrapped around her. For a few disoriented seconds, she forgot where she was. Then, reality settled in. The hotel, the bed, the quiet hum of the heater filling the room. She sat up slowly, rubbing her face. The sheets were too clean, the air too still. She had spent years adapting to noise, to cold, to sleeping with one eye open. This silence felt unnatural. A knock at the door made her tense instantly. She stood, her heart pounding as she approached. "Who is it?" "Room service," a muffled voice answered. She frowned. "I didn't order anything." "Compliments of Mr. Lancaster." Hazel hesitated, then slowly cracked the door open. A hotel employee stood there, pushing a cart with a covered tray and a steaming cup of coffee. She wanted to refuse. She should have refused. But the scent of fresh food hit her like a punch, her stomach twisting with hunger. Without a word, she stepped aside. The employee wheeled the cart in, placed everything neatly, and left with a polite nod. Hazel stared at the tray. She could walk away. She could leave right now, disappear again, vanish before Caleb had the chance to dig deeper. But instead, she pulled off the lid and sat down. The first bite was almost painful, the kind of pain that comes when the body remembers what it's been deprived of. She didn't know if Caleb had left the food out of guilt or obligation. But for now, she didn't care. She just ate. Caleb sat in the hotel cafe downstairs, stirring his untouched coffee. He hadn't slept. His conversation with Jace played over and over in his head. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. But Jace was wrong. Hazel wasn't beyond saving, she had just spent too long believing she was. A movement in the lobby caught his attention. Hazel. She stepped out of the elevator, her posture guarded but less tense than the night before. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Hazel walked toward him. She sat down across from him, pulling the coffee cup toward her. Caleb watched in silence as she took a slow sip. Finally, she set the cup down and exhaled. "I don't know why I stayed." Her voice was quiet but steady. Caleb held her gaze. "Maybe you don't want to run anymore." Hazel scoffed, but there was no real bite in it. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the beginning of something else, something fragile, something real. The morning light filtered through the hotel curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Hazel sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. She hadn't slept much. The bed had been too soft, the silence too loud. Her fingers traced the corner of the key card Caleb had given her the night before. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Jace's words echoed in her mind. Hazel clenched her jaw. He didn't know her, he didn't know what she wanted. A knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before standing, crossing the room cautiously. When she cracked the door open, Caleb stood on the other side holding 2 coffee cups. "I wasn't sure how you take it anymore," he admitted, "so I got both." Hazel stared at him for a long moment, before sighing and stepping aside. Caleb entered, setting the cups on the small table by the window. "Did you sleep?" Hazel crossed her arms. "Why are you still here?" Caleb exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I don't want this to be the last time I see you." Hazel looked away, her throat tightening. "I know I can't erase the past," Caleb continued, "but I can be here now." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Hazel sat down, grabbing one of the coffees. She didn't say anything. But she didn't ask him to leave, and for the first time that was enough. Caleb hesitated before opening the door to the house. It had been years since Hazel had set foot there, but nothing had really changed. That was the problem. The house still carried echoes of the past, of silences too loud, of conversations that should have happened but never did. Hazel stepped inside cautiously, her arms crossed over her chest as if bracing herself. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flickered over the details of the home she had once known so well, the old piano in the corner, the crystal chandelier above the dining table, a framed picture on the wall, one of the few that still had her in it. She let out a breath, barely a whisper. "I don't know why I came." Caleb swallowed hard. "Because I asked you to." Hazel let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "And since when do I do what you ask?" There was no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion, maybe a hint of something else. "I don't expect anything from you, Hazel," Caleb said quietly. "Not your forgiveness, not your trust. I just want you to eat dinner in a warm house, even if it's only for tonight." Hazel didn't respond, but after a long moment, she moved toward the dining table. She sat down, her posture still guarded, but she was there. They ate mostly in silence. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't unbearable either, and that was something. Halfway through the meal, Hazel set down her fork and spoke without looking at him. "You think one dinner makes up for everything?" "No," Caleb said immediately. "Not even close." She nodded as if she had expected that answer. "Good." A few more moments passed before Caleb finally broke the silence again. "Hazel, I should have looked harder. I should have never stopped looking." Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. She didn't tell him he was right, but she didn't tell him he was wrong either. After a moment, she let out a slow breath. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Caleb's throat tightened, but he nodded. "I'll be here anyway." Hazel looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, there was something in her eyes that wasn't just anger. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. Hope. A fragile, uncertain kind of hope. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly, then, barely, just barely, she smiled, and Caleb knew that for the first time she wasn't running. Not tonight. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but when it does, we have to decide what to do with them. What would you have done in Caleb's place or in Hazel's? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.